Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the PEPSA Inquiry video series. I'm Nancy Fichtman, and I've been having the joy and honor and the pleasure of guiding you through learning a little bit about the inquiry process as a part of your work for PEPSA. And I'm thrilled to be back again for the third video. So let's get down to it. And I, as I have in the past, am going to begin by sharing my screen so that you can see some of the PowerPoint slides that I designed just for you to teach about the process of data collection. And that is the topic of this third PEPSA inquiry video. Of course, let's begin though with just a very quick review. In the first inquiry video, you were introduced to the process of inquiry, and it was defined as systematic, intentional study by teachers of their own practice. And you learned about the 5 components of inquiry that constitute one cycle, and you see those 5 components on the screen. And then in the second video, we saw an example of inquiry as a way of being by visiting the classroom of Stephanie Whitaker, who you see on this screen. And that served to enhance the first example that you saw of the inquiry process of Debbie Hubble in the very first video. So now, as we begin our third video on data collection, you have already seen 2 examples of teacher inquirers, and you've already seen examples of the kinds of data that they collected. So you may want to be thinking about their examples and their stories as we go through this particular inquiry video on data collection. We also, in the second video, talked a little bit more about developing a question, and actually that's going to be an important component that relates to data collection. And, any old question doesn't quite do for inquiry. You want to develop a really good question. So we learned about 5 different components of a good inquiry question in the second video. And those components are something you're passionate about, your question connecting to other aspects of the work that's going on in your community and or in your school and or in the district, a focus on student learning, something that's genuine, a question you really don't know the answer to, and you're not engaging in inquiry to answer a question that is to prove something you already know, or is to change somebody else because the only person you have control of is you. So you're focusing inward, a question that focuses on your practice so that you can make changes based on what you've learned. And then finally, we talked about good questions being open-ended, to be inviting of capturing all of the great complexity that's inherent in teaching. So that's where we've been. And today we're going to travel to that second component of the inquiry process, data collection. And as we do that, I want to start out with what could be a kind of provocative question to pose if we're going to talk about data collection. And that question is, do professionals in education really need data to deliver quality? Well, it shouldn't be a surprise to you that for someone who loves the inquiry process as much as I do, and if you haven't figured that out yet, I absolutely do love the inquiry process because I've just seen again and again and again how incredibly powerful it can be. And this inquiry process contains one component called data collection. It really shouldn't be surprising to you how I would answer this question. But before I do answer this question, let me first just tell you a tiny bit more about me. So you learned in the first PEPSA video that I am passionate about inquiry. And in fact, I've spent my entire professional life, more than 30 years, studying educators' use of data to inform practice through the process called inquiry you've been learning about. Writing your PEPSA inquiry book and many others, and publishing numerous articles on or related to learning from data and teaching throughout the United States and several countries on the topic. So again, it's going to be really easy to guess my answer to that $1 million question that we're posing to frame our discussion of data collection. Do professionals in education really need data to deliver quality? Of course, my answer to that question is a resounding yes. But let me spend a little time qualifying my answer just a bit. So I believe that all educators already do use data to deliver quality, and that you already use data to deliver quality. So I think it's really important as we embark on engaging in a cycle of inquiry as a part of PEPSA to better understand a component of working with students with autism, that you realize this is something you're already doing. And I've talked about that in other videos. So all great educators are curious about their teaching. All great educators have questions in their heads about their practice. And then all great educators use data to kind of answer those questions. But we do that in a very informal and kind of happenstance way. And it's not very visible, and we don't have a common language to talk about this notion of being curious about teaching and studying teaching and pouring what we learn back into our practice so that we can be the very best educators we can be. And so this process of inquiry really is something you already do, but we are just in these PEPSA inquiry videos giving you a language to talk about it, and we're making the process a little less happenstance, more intentional, and creating a space within the PEPSA program for you to have the time to discuss and engage in this wonderful work of reflecting on your practice. So, that said, I think you should feel really good moving forward because you already know about data collection. So, for example, as educators, you probably look at student scores on exams or other quantitative measures of student achievement to give you an understanding of their mastery of content. So, that is data. But there are many additional kinds of data that we use to inform our instructional decisions, but we might not necessarily think of it as data. So that's one of the things we're going to do in inquiry process is in this video is we're going to name many more kinds of data than maybe that you're used to or aware of. And then the second thing I want to share with you is that unfortunately, when we talk about data collection, in many educational contexts across the nation, I believe we're drowning in data. There is so much data everywhere, and it doesn't help us because there's so much of it that it becomes an unsystematic piling up of a bunch of stuff we collect, but we don't necessarily know what to do with it, and we don't have the time that it takes to do something well with it. So there we go. Enter the inquiry cycle that you have been learning about. And what's so cool about that process and data collection being a part of it is that no longer do we have an unsystematic piling up of tons of data that we're just drowning in, because data collection is linked to a wondering, a question that you formulate about your practice. So that really helps guide data collection and make it really meaningful. So we are going to talk about that in this video, and let's start by just simply defining data collection. So data collection for a teacher inquirer, and this is really important to think about, it simply means capturing the action, learning, and thinking that is occurring in a classroom and or in a school. So schools are crazy busy places, and teaching and learning moves at such a rapid pace. So what we're trying to do with data collection is capture what's occurring because so much happens in a school day. If we don't capture it in some way, we will not remember probably at least half of the things that have happened that could potentially be insightful in relationship to a particular question we're passionate about exploring. So now we move to the numerous strategies for data collection. And if you think back to that very first introduction to inquiry video, I kind of gave you a teaser. I showed you this slide and I said, don't worry, we're going to have a whole video in the PEPSA inquiry video series that focuses on data collection. So now I'm going to pull this slide apart and we're going to take each one of these data collection strategies one by one, keeping in mind the definition of data collection for a teacher inquirer that I just shared. So let's start with that most obvious one, the one that you are probably very aware of and think about and use a lot, and that's quantitative measures of student achievement. So there is nothing wrong with using quantitative measures of student achievement. As you know, we can gain lots of insights in relationship to students' mastery of content and their progression by looking at quantitative measures of student achievement. But remember, we talked about how complex teaching is. And I also think that lots of times in educational contexts, the only data that we really capture and look at is quantitative measures of student achievement. So this is a great data source for a teacher inquirer, but there are many others as well. So let's look at some of those others. So the second form of data is simply student work. Really, data collection is not about going out and doing something different in your teaching. It's just about capturing what's occurring. So student work is a naturally occurring form of data that could be very insightful to the wondering that you develop. And oftentimes we don't think of necessarily student work as data. We think about it in terms of using it to assess a student's progress, to assign some kind of numerical grade, to check it off maybe in a grade book, etc. And then we hand the students' work back to them and they take it home in their backpacks and we don't see it again. However, if you can collect student work over time, again, depending on your wondering, if it informs your wondering to look at student work over time by collecting it and analyzing it, then go ahead and collect it. Keep it so that you can return to it and look at it and compare and contrast different pieces of student work to each other and or a student's progression through different work samples and what you can learn from looking at how are their work samples improving over time or not improving over time. What are the things that you notice about them? Okay, a third kind of data is field notes or anecdotal notes. So this is data that we really use all the time. Once again, one of the things we do as teachers is we observe our students, right? And we're making mental notes of the things that we're observing, and we may adjust based on what we're observing. So here's that thing. We're going to once again, make those observations a little more intentional. It's something you naturally do, but now you're going to capture it in some way on paper or on post-it notes or in a notebook or any way that you can capture what's going on in the classroom in relationship to the wondering that you have. So in the little image that you see on this slide, this is field notes that was taken for a teacher by a colleague. And this particular teacher had a wondering about shifting discussions in her classroom based on wanting literature circle discussions to move from a ping pong match between her as the teacher and each one of her students, meaning she would always pose questions or make comments and then call on students, and then it would come back to her. And she really wanted to help her students develop a true literature discussion where they talked with one another and it didn't look like a ping pong match. So this particular teacher had a colleague come into the classroom and just at the start of her inquiry, sort of capture the interactions that were occurring. And you can see that ping pong match that she was hoping to change captured in some of these very early field notes. As time moved on, though, she was able to observe and use these field notes as a way to progress how the changes she was making in her practice, facilitating literature discussions, changed the nature of the interactions that students had among themselves. So that's an example of field notes. And again, it's just the idea of capturing those observations that you already do as a teacher in some way so that you can return to them and look at them over time and reflect on them. Okay, the fourth way to collect data that again we do all the time as teachers is interviews or focus groups. So interviews might be one-on-one with an individual student or learner, and focus groups means we're interacting with more than one learner and we're asking them a series of questions to gain understanding about what they're learning in relationship to our wondering. So, a great example of an interview was Stephanie Whitaker circulating around her classroom and stopping and chatting with Stoudemire, the student that she picked his brain about how he was making sense of fractions and the concept that she was teaching at the time. So again, I want to illustrate over and over again in this video on data collection that data collection is something you're doing all the time as a teacher. It's something that we naturally do, just like Stephanie circulating around the classroom and stopping and asking students about their learning. But when we're doing that in relationship to a wondering that we've posed about our practice, then all we have to do is find a way to capture it. And it becomes a wonderfully rich source of data that we can go back to and learn about our question in relationship to. A fifth form of data collection is digital pictures and also videos. So I don't have my phone beside me because I didn't want it to distract me as I was doing these videos. But just about everybody now has a smartphone, and that gives you the opportunity to snap pictures as you are teaching and inquiring into your teaching practice and or even take some videos. So this is a really nice way to capture the action that is occurring in your classroom in relationship to the question that you posed. You may have heard the saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, really, pictures can be very powerful sources of data for a teacher inquirer. A sixth form of data is journals or weblogs. Now, remember the definition of data collection for a teacher inquirer is capturing the action, the learning, and the thinking that is occurring in the classroom in relationship to an inquiry question that's been posed. So thinking, we don't often think of our thinking as data, but if we can capture the thinking that we do as teachers, it's really a wonderfully rich way to gain insights into our teaching and how it evolves over time. So keeping a teacher journal or a weblog and responding to some prompts over time in relationship to the question that you're posing can really help you, again, gain insights into a question that you're exploring. Now, this is a tough one, I think, for teachers to think of as a form of data. What do you mean by thinking? We're not used to thinking that our thinking as teachers is valuable. But it really is. We are professionals. We have a real incredible source of experience and knowledge about teaching that we both have learned in formal teacher preparation, informal teacher professional development efforts, but also the wisdom of our experience working with learners over time. So if we can capture that thinking, that's fabulous. That's a really wonderful source of data. If you're having a hard time thinking about why it would be valuable, I always love to think about the Harry Potter stories in relationship to this. So if you're a Harry Potter fan, you know Albus Dumbledore is the school revered head of the school, Hogwarts. And one of the things he does is he extracts his memories and he saves them in a pensieve. And the value of that is that he can return to the pensieve at any time and he can retrieve memories. And with each time he goes back and re-looks at memories, it's another level of reflection and he learns. But then, of course, probably what's most important is not only can he revisit his memories, but he can take others with him to view his reflections on things that have happened in class. I'm sorry, in his pensieve. And so, for example, he has brought Harry with him, and they've retrieved memories together, and they've looked at them together, and he uses them as a teaching tool, and Harry learns. So this idea of keeping a journal can be so valuable for you as a teacher. And I hope that might be one form of data collection that you might try for your PEPSA inquiry. A seventh form of data collection is surveys. Now, that one is pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to talk too much about that, but anytime you can give out surveys in relationship to your teaching and learn from your students based on how they respond, that can be really useful if it relates to the question that you posed. And then finally, well, it's not final, there's actually two more left, but the last two are ones, once again, you might not think of data, but number 8 is colleague feedback. So remember, I talked about the value of keeping a journal to capture your thinking in relationship to the wondering you posed. And that thinking is so valuable because you have so much knowledge. Well, not only do you have so much knowledge about teaching, but your colleagues do. And we're not used to tapping into and valuing the great knowledge that our colleagues have developed from for themselves as well, based on their rich experiences teaching, as well as, just like you, the formal teacher preparation that they've had, as well as professional development events that they have been a part of throughout their teaching careers. So one of the things I love about inquiry is it really honors teachers and it honors the knowledge that they have in their head. So for data collection, we just have to capture that in some kind of way. And so colleague feedback is a great way to collect data to gain insights into the wondering that you posed. This is also a good time to pause to just share how valuable collaboration and inquiry is. And I want to refer you to your book that you are using about inquiry that you received as a resource through PEPSA, that to share with you that there's a lot more about the value of collaboration in that book. So please feel free to return to that and to learn a little bit more about the value of collaboration in the inquiry process. Okay, drum roll, please. Here we go. The final form of data collection, and again, this may seem really puzzling to you, literature, that seems like an odd form of data collection. Actually, literature is a form of data that every teacher inquirer actually should collect as a part of their inquiry journey, their inquiry cycle. And that's because there's a lot known about teaching and learning and education. And all of that knowledge is something that we can tap into as it relates to the wondering that we've posed. So I want to pause for a minute and just spend a second talking about the difference between university research and inquiry. Because if you remember back in the first inquiry video, we talked about how this is something that you ordinarily do. So you're not trying to emulate the research that an academic does as a university. You're really doing something different, something very personal, but it is a systematic and intentional study of your practice. And why I say you're not trying to emulate a person at the university, an academic researcher, is because the images that you had when I said the word research in that first video, one of them might have been like spending hours and hours going through journal articles and going through books, etc. So that's what an academic researcher does. They do an extensive review of the literature, is what it's called. And they do that to show a gap in the literature that needs to be addressed by the research that they do. That's not what a teacher researcher does, though. So I don't want you to feel overwhelmed by this notion of literature. So let's look at the difference between university research and inquiry. The purpose of what an academic researcher does is to advance a field. That's why they do a huge search of the literature and they read so much on the topic that they're interested in studying. In contrast, for inquiry, a teacher inquirer's purpose is to improve classroom practice. So it's not critical that you read everything there is to read about the topic that you're studying. Your problem to study comes from your practice, not from the literature. An academic researcher's problem of study comes from the literature. So I hope you see that contrast there. The literature is really important for an inquirer, but as simply as one additional way to collect data to give them insights and inform the wondering that they are developing. Now, the focus of a university research is control, prediction, impact, or explanation. And for a classroom inquirer, a teacher inquirer, the focus is to provide insights into classroom and schools to make change. So once again, you see a contrast, you see the difference. The process for a university researcher is linear. The process that we've talked about already for inquiry is cyclical. It's really more a way of being. And in that first video, we even talked about the cyclical nature of inquiry being kind of messy, but that's how real classrooms are. They're not controlled settings where academic research often occurs. They are natural settings. And, you can't predict how students will ever respond the way that you can predict something in a controlled setting might happen. The ownership in university researcher is an outsider. It is a university researcher who decides on the research purpose and question and then comes in maybe to study you. And you may have been a part of a university research study, an academic study, and you had to sign informed consent, right, to be a part of that. So it was the outsider's voice that mattered in what was being researched, not yours. You were serving as a participant in their study. Another thing I absolutely love about inquiry is that the ownership is the insider. You own the inquiry process. You are in the driver's seat of your own professional learning. So you see a little bit of a difference there as well. And then finally, for university research, the impact is meant to be broad, to again impact an entire field or inform an entire field. And for inquiry, the process that you're going to engage in as a part of PEPSA, the impact is meant to be local. What you're interested in is becoming the very best teacher of students with autism that you can be by systematically and intentionally studying your practice and studying practices that the literature tells us are evidence-based, that have some promise. And so we return then to this notion of literature as a form of data. That's all it is for a teacher inquirer. We can look to the literature to help develop our questions and to know that the kinds of interventions and actions that we're choosing to implement with students with autism are evidenced or research-based. They hold promise for being successful and making a difference to the learners. However, any practice is going to play out differently for each individual teacher and each individual learner. So that's why we need both academic research and inquiry, and the two of them just interlocked with one another, and they develop a real beautiful way to learn in and from practice. Your PEPSA uh, facilitator and your card partners can help you locate some literature, again, not an extensive search, but some literature as a form of data as you move forward and develop your question and gain insights into your question. Okay, so I hope that you are excited by all of the many forms of data that we just reviewed, and maybe some that you never thought of before as data, as you think about what kinds of data might be useful to you in your practice moving forward. Okay, so to move forward, the next thing that you will do is plan your PEPSA inquiry journey. And, when you are planning, I love this metaphor journey. When you're planning a trip, you refer to a map and you use the map to create and guide your travels. So what you'll be doing as a part of PEPSA, now that you have some knowledge about developing a question and you have some knowledge about many different ways to collect data to inform that question, you will be planning a PEPSA inquiry journey for yourself. So one way to do that is to create something called an inquiry brief. And basically that's your map. You're going to map out a path to take to study your work with students with autism. And what I want to do is just briefly define an inquiry brief. It's a short overview or outline of your inquiry journey. And you probably are wondering what it looks like and what it includes. So in order to answer that first question, what does it look like? I want to once again direct you to that great, rich resource that you have been provided by PEPSA, your book about inquiry. Whether you are learning from the 4th edition or the 5th edition of that inquiry book, in both editions, there are wonderful examples of inquiry briefs. And again, there's also a whole chapter on data collection strategies. So all of the strategies that I shared with you, you can see many more examples of what they look like and how teachers have used them to inform a question in the book that you received about inquiry as part of your PEPSA program and participation. So don't forget you have that resource. It's a rich, rich resource, and it will really help you and supplement these videos that I have been recording for you. Okay, so when you look at the examples from your book, you'll notice usually what they include is just a brief paragraph or so that provides background, like leading to your inquiry, kind of, this notion of what was your problem of practice? What was the thing that was keeping you up at night that led to you posing this inquiry question? So it'll end with a purpose statement and then a statement of your question or your wonderings. And then you'll articulate any intervention, action, activity that you plan to try as a part of your inquiry. And once again, your card partners and or your PEPSA facilitators are going to be fantastic resources to help you consider interventions, actions, activities that are evidence-based that will help you address some of the needs that you are feeling that you want to learn more about in your work with students with autism. And then you'll articulate the ways that you will collect data. And an important note is teacher inquirers, because teaching is so complex, teacher inquirers always use more than one source of data to help inform their question. So you want to think about of all the data collection strategies that we talked about today, as you begin to develop your plan, consider using more than one type of data. So push yourself a little bit. Maybe try some data collection strategies that are a little less familiar or comfortable for you. And you may learn how incredibly powerful they are to foster your ability to reflect and learn from your practice. And then also remember, we talked in the first video how data collection and data analysis are really interconnected to one another. Well, guess what? We're going to have a whole video. The fourth and final PEPSA inquiry video is going to be on data analysis. So we'll talk all about that next time. But, usually you'll talk about how you're going to collect data just very briefly in an inquiry brief, and then also just note how it's going to be analyzed. And then finally, in your inquiry plan, it's usually very helpful to create a little timeline for how your study is going to unfold. So again, not pages and pages, not a master's thesis, not a crazy detailed proposal that likely would not make sense for the process of inquiry, because remember, we talked about how you learn as you go in this process, especially when it's your first cycle. But instead, putting together an outline and fleshing out some pieces of those outlines so that you do have a plan, at least to get started. You have your map for your PEPSA inquiry journey. And then you follow your map. And then if you have to take some detours, as often happens, because you're learning something new as you go, then you take some detours along the way. And that's that idea that, inquiry is not linear. It doesn't unfold step by step in this nice, neat way. It's cyclical, it's messy. You jump back and forth between developing your question, collecting data, analyzing data, taking actions, and even sharing, because sharing includes both sharing the outcome of your cycle of inquiry when it's completed, but sharing also means along the way, you can tap into your colleagues and your mentors and your card partners and your PEPSA facilitators, and share with them what you're learning along the way. And that's also very helpful as well. So pretty much what we've done in this video is learned about some different forms of collecting data and talked about the importance of just creating a plan to follow that serves as your map for your inquiry journey. But it doesn't mean that you have to follow what you've mapped out lockstep. As you go and you learn, you may take some detours, but you would never start a trip with no route at all. You wouldn't just get in your car and start driving, right? So it's the same with inquiry. You wouldn't just start inquiry without some kind of thought and mapping out where you are headed in your destination to gain insights into the wondering that you've posed. So that is all an inquiry brief is. So with that, let's end with some think time as we've done with all of the videos. And the question for you to take with you away from this video is, what are some ways you might collect data to capture the action, learning, and thinking that occurs as you work with students with autism? So I hope you have enjoyed this third inquiry video. And of course, as I always end, I have to end with happy inquiring. Thanks, everybody. And I'm looking forward to seeing you once again for one final time in the fourth and final PEPSA inquiry video, which will focus on data analysis. So see you soon, everybody.